the day or two afterwards, drove to a little private beach in my hometown and sat there and wondered if I could bear to live with being blamed.
When you were in the car, what was the other voice telling you to do?
Drive forward, drive into the water, drive until the water covers me and the pain goes away.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Series 6 of Crisis What Crisis. I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 7 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad, in my experience, has been just as useful as the good. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky, and lucky survivors of crisis. But you'll also hear from renowned crisis managers, mental health and performance experts, and advisors who were in the room when major crises have hit, all of them offering useful, practical coping techniques and tips to help you find your way to a more resilient life. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. Just search for Mindstream, that's Mind with a Y, on Spotify, and you'll find some really great playlists. If you enjoy what you hear on this podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating and review. It helps enormously. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our handle is at Crisis What Crisis Podcast. To kick off this new series, I'm joined by Ginny Buckingham, the quietly spoken, devoted mum of two who, for a period of her life, faced the frankly unfathomable trauma of being publicly blamed for thousands of deaths. Ginny was the boss of Boston's Logan Airport, where on the morning of September the 11th, 2001, a group of terrorists boarded American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, airliners that, of course, very soon after takeoff, they would hijack and later fly into New York's World Trade Center. Ginny led a daunting, frankly unprecedented crisis management operation at Logan, but within 48 hours of the attacks, the blame game began. It was wrongly claimed that the terrorists had targeted Logan because of its weak security systems and links to Boston politics. There were angry demands for Ginny to resign and, as one newspaper put it, atone for the massacre. Political bosses, as so often happens in crisis, saw the opportunity for a scapegoat. Blame, as Ginny puts it, gave them the opportunity to get control of an uncontrollable situation. 6 weeks after the attacks, she was forced to resign, but faced years of continued accusations and a personal legal claim from the wife of a 9/11 victim. As the second anniversary of the atrocity approached, Ginny sat alone in her car and considered suicide. This is a conversation about blame, the psychological impact of public scandal, guilt, and recovery, of how when crisis, politics, and media collide, those in the crosshairs can find themselves in the most brutal of positions. In her book, On My Watch, and indeed during this podcast, Ginny stresses time and again that her difficulties are nothing as compared to those who lost their lives on 9/11, of course, and the families that they left behind. But hers is a story of how public crisis can so often create powerful tides of misplaced retribution and blame that wreak havoc on those unfortunate enough to be in the way. That even after she was very publicly exonerated by the 9/11 Commission, the psychological damage continued, demonstrating, I think, that crisis can have a very long, unseen, but very damaging tail. Ginny hopes that by telling her story, our leaders might think twice before reaching for the scapegoat button when trouble comes, and I hope she's right. Huge thanks to her for joining us, and I hope you find this podcast useful.
Virginia Buckingham. Ginny, welcome to Crisis What Crisis, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Ginny, your brilliant book, On My Watch, was published, I think, almost exactly 2 years ago now. Was it a difficult decision to write your story in such detail? You know, there's a risk, of course, that it would reignite some of those darker feelings for you, perhaps even open you up to the fresh criticism, however unjustified, that comes with sort of putting yourself out there, particularly in this day and age.
My only hesitation was I don't want anyone to think I equate my story or my situation with that of the 9/11 families. And
of course.
I mean, of course, my story is nothing like theirs, and what I suffered is nothing like what they have suffered. So that was my one hesitation. And I think make that pretty clear both in the book and how I talk about it.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'm a writer at heart, and I found I could do nothing but write about it in order to try to make sense of it. And I didn't know for sure it would turn into a book. I didn't know if the book would get published. I just knew to work through it in my own heart and soul, I had to write it down.
Did you write much about it, as you were living it, if you like? Obviously not in the immediate moment, because we'll talk about that, because you had such a huge job to do. But did you find that at all helpful as a process, if indeed you did sort of take the time to write?
Sometimes. I think time and perspective are really necessary. I think when you're telling a story that's a memoir or a personal journey story, because while you're living it, you can't always make heads or tails of it or communicate it in a way that has meaning. So I would say it was mostly in the aftermath, as I reflected on what happened.
Tell us a little, if you don't mind, about life before politics, which was the first sort of staging post in your career. Tell me about the young Ginny. You're one of 8 children, I think.
I am. I grew up in New England, 7th of 8, the youngest girl. My dad was a milkman, and my mom was a hospital clerk. And, we lived a very, fun, simple life, playing wiffle ball in the backyard and basketball and riding our bikes in the neighborhood. And, life was very normal. And I saw this brochure for Boston College, which to me seemed like something out of a dream, to be able to apply to a school like that. So I took that chance and got in and came to Boston when I was 17 and never looked back.
Wow. So you're the first in your family to have followed that path.
Well, others went to college. About half went to college, but none out of state and none to such a big, prestigious school. So a bit of a risk.
As a young woman after college, you moved quite quickly into political communications. And you, in fact, were the first woman to have been appointed as a chief of staff after communications. You moved onto that more significant role, if you like, as a chief of staff to the governor of Massachusetts. In those roles, you will have seen how the blame game can be deployed in politics, particularly during campaign periods, and you were involved in some pretty significant campaigns. We'll talk about blame culture in more detail later, but how do you reflect now on the part that blame, the need to find someone to pin a problem on, as you say in the book rather brilliantly, in politics, that blame is the means by which politicians can get control of the uncontrollable, I think is your view.
Well, one hopes that isn't deployed unfairly, but of course it is in many different situations. I learned in politics, as I'm sure you did, that it can be a simplistic business, and making things understandable and quickly resolvable is too often the go-to, rather than really digging into the very complex issues that often are what are presented. And, I can't say I wasn't part of that culture when I was in government. I was in the State House here in Massachusetts for 10 years. And I'm sure that I played that game with others. not in a situation as serious and world-changing as 9/11, of course. But part of my hope is that stories like mine send a little message to political leaders that isn't the way to solve problems, and that isn't serving their constituents to just blame somebody and brush the problem under the rug.
Yeah. Almost impossible, or much harder to do now, because of the way that media works, because of social media and the speed with which judgments are now made, even so much faster. When we'll talk about, obviously in your situation, it moved very, very quickly against you. But speed has increased, not decreased, since then, isn't it?
I'm so grateful there was no social media back when this happened in 2001, because it was so awful and so brutal and so personal in the media against me. I can't imagine how much worse it would have been, exponentially worse.
You were appointed to the role of CEO of Massport, the authority that oversees the running of Logan Airport, in 1999. It was a big job that you were qualified to do, but I assume very excited to do. A huge challenge.
Well, so people don't believe me sometimes when I say this, but I wasn't excited to do it, in that I loved my job as chief of staff. I was chief of staff to a second governor, asked to stay on in that role. I just had my first child, so I was home on maternity leave when the job running Massport got offered to me, and I turned it down. I turned it down 3 times until the governor himself asked me to do it. And it wasn't because I knew I couldn't do it. I knew I could. It was the same type of role I had in the State House, which is driving an agenda, making sure that professionals operating the facilities could get the improvements done that they had to do through a very political process. I just didn't want to change jobs, but you don't say no to a governor, especially after being asked 3 times. So I ultimately said yes. And I absolutely loved it. It was a lot of fun. It was important. We were running some of the most important economic facilities in the region, the airport, the Port of Boston, 2 other smaller airports. The issues were thorny. The politics were difficult. It was everything I loved to do.
Have you, as a result of your experiences, have you sometimes gone back to that day when you finally, agreed to take the job? Have you gone back there in your mind to that day and thought to yourself, if only I'd made a different decision?
I try not to, because it's not useful. It doesn't serve me to do that. And so when the thought inevitably, of course, pops up in my mind, I let it go. There's no worth in dwelling there.
See, that's an easy thing to say and very hard to do, isn't it? To say to yourself, this is pointless. I'm not going to allow my mind to spend any time there. But it's a constant battle for all sorts of reasons. For instance, and we'll get into this, my healing journey took a long time. I regret that. Of course I do. I wish it was faster. I wish that I had understood things clearly earlier. But I also try to push that away and let that go, because it took what it took. And I can't dwell that, I wish that I had been stronger earlier on. Can we go to the day itself, to September 11th, 2001? Given, as we just discussed, the sort of progress that you were making in the job, you're on top of your game, really, as you, I think, are in your car that morning when you get the first phone call. Are you able to sort of take us back there, just before the phone call? I mean, you're focused on the job, one imagines, the day ahead. What is it you got to do? I think you were going to take a flight, actually, weren't you?
I was, the bright blue sky morning of September 11th, 2001, the usual routine, getting my son, who was then 2, off to daycare with my husband, driving into the airport, reading my briefing papers, because I was going to Washington that morning to meet with the head of the Federal Aviation Administration about the runway project we were trying to get approved. And it was a real key meeting with members of the president's administration sitting in as well. So I was really focused on what I had to achieve that day, and stopped for coffee at my regular stop on the way, and was just listening to the news radio as I did every morning, and heard about the first report, the first plane going into the tower in New York, but no one knew what kind of plane it was. I assumed, like so many did, that it was just a small plane, pilot off course, an accident. And then I continued to listen, and was listening live when the second plane flew into the tower and was reported on instantaneously from the streets of Manhattan. And of course, then, I knew it was not an accident. Wasn't that long after when I got the first call from my office at Logan, saying 6 words that I talk about in the book that live in my heart and soul, that changed the world, which were that 2 planes were off the radar. 2 planes were off the radar at Logan Airport.
Yeah.
We didn't know that they were involved. We just knew that 2 planes couldn't be found.
Do you remember the sort of, because you're a woman who's been around crisis, who's been in some rooms when the proper difficult problems are being dealt with. Do you remember, though, what the sort of chain of thought was for you, just from a crisis management perspective, as you began to process what was happening?
Yes. First of all, as a mom, I only wanted to turn around and go home and get my son out of daycare. I wanted to protect him, and I knew I couldn't. So that was the first thought I had, is go home. No, you can't. Go to work. So I knew that we had to get there fast. I knew that we had to get an understanding as quickly as we could of where those 2 planes were, and were there any others that were out there were involved. And I have to say that perhaps it was my experience dealing with governors who had to oversee many crises in the time that I was in the State House. I was very focused and very calm. I understood that this opportunity to try to help was something I had to do in the best way that I've ever done anything. And I just simply stayed focused on that and got to my office as fast as I could, and tried to gather the information that we could and pass it on to safety officials and the governor and the mayor. And shut down the airport was the big task. Well, there wasn't time to sit around and think. We had to shut down hundreds of planes that were on the ground waiting to take off. We had to clear the terminals of thousands of people, all while making sure that if they had any information, they were sharing it with the public safety officials. We had to prepare for the families who knew their loved ones were flying out that day and couldn't reach them, and were coming to the airport to see if they could get any information. So it was an enormous task that had to be handled quickly and with tremendous discipline and focus.
Logistical, operational, and deeply, deeply emotional, and in waves. So you're getting to the even the most basic understanding of what was happening itself must have been just from a internal communications perspective. I remember I was a deputy editor on a newspaper here on that day, and I was stood in the editor's office watching it on the television, just as journalists were all over the world. And it took some time before people could begin to comprehend actually what had happened. So from the time that you're getting that phone call to the time where you're able to make a decision, we need to shut the airport down. How long was that?
Minutes. It was minutes. It had to be done fast. The airlines themselves, I would give them great credit, were the first in the United States to pull their planes down and say, land wherever you can. The FAA followed shortly after that. But everyone involved in aviation at that time had never faced anything like this, and that they rose to the challenge immediately and knew that the thing they had to do was get planes down safely wherever they could. I just give them so much credit. We had trained for emergencies regularly at the airport, as required by the FAA, but we did more than was required because we wanted to learn from other mishaps around the country and the world and make sure we had the safest airport possible. In fact, just earlier the year before, we had trained for a plane going into the harbor right off of the runway at Logan into Boston Harbor. We never trained for anything like this. No one could fathom anything like this, that the planes themselves would be used as weapons.
Yes.
Was just unimaginable.
Yes. And I imagine from the perspective of your people at Logan as well, all manner of connections, of concern, of the unknown, and then eventually, I suspect, also, of course, of grief. Amongst your own team, must have been terribly difficult to manage.
It was very, very hard to watch because these people, especially some of our top aviation officials, had come from the airlines, so they knew these flight attendants and these pilots personally that were missing, and at the same time that they're trying to absorb that loss, they knew in their heart and soul that the industry they loved was changed forever. Their jobs were never going to be the same as the aviation industry that they had embraced for its excitement and its adventure in the past. And so all of those things, and then couple that with the blame game starting so quickly in Boston. Within 2 days, there were front page stories saying, was it Logan Airport's fault? And so they've lost their friends, they've lost the career that they thought they had embraced, and suddenly they're being blamed for it. Certainly my name was the one being bandied about, but the implication was that Logan had done something wrong, and just so hard to grapple with. I know how I approached it was I pushed the emotion away. Maybe not the healthiest thing to do, but it was all I could do, and it really wasn't on purpose. I just couldn't dwell in the grief. I had to just stay focused on doing the job.
Well, as a crisis manager, you're taught, aren't you, that that's actually the only way to do the job? Because once emotions seep in, bad decisions tend to seep in, or there's the risk of bad decisions once emotions involved. So you did the right thing in that sense professionally, but as you say, that really was the start of difficulty from a personal point of view. Ginny, having been around politics so much, when the blame started, were you surprised?
I actually was, because in those first few days, common sense would tell you that planes were hijacked from 3 different airports at exactly the same time. And in addition, an additional airport in Maine where 2 of the hijackers had boarded to come to Logan. So 4 airports were involved. That told me, and I think told most people, that it was a national security issue or even an international security issue,
Sure.
Not an issue specific to Logan Airport. So yes, I was surprised to see that focus so quickly.
I suppose my question is not surprised because you thought that someone had done something wrong, because as you say, all logic pointed you to the absolute opposite conclusion. But were you surprised that when something so huge happened, that there will be people, often in the media and in politics and in other places in public life, that people decided to vent their anger in a particular direction?
I, of course, recognize that would happen maybe at some level. It was more the velocity, I guess is the better word, of it, and the lack of any leader standing up and saying, wait a second, this is not right. This is really off base. And because that didn't happen from our acting governor at the time or the mayor at the time, and certainly my saying it wasn't going to be listened to because, I just had, I think, lost that platform being in the midst of the crisis. There was nobody pushing back. And so it kind of took on a life of its own.
Did that element surprise you? That there was, that the people who perhaps could have made the situation easier for you that they disappeared into the wallpaper?
It did. I hoped for more support, not just for me, but for my colleagues. I hoped for clarity for the public's sake. I don't think it served the public to let the story become that there was something wrong with Logan Airport. And that's why this happened. Yes, I mean, I know the two governors I worked for would surely have stood up, whether it was me or anyone else, and said, this is not about Logan Airport. This is about national security and terrorism. And let's do what we can to make things better.
Let's talk in a little bit more detail about some of that criticism, because to say it was unpleasant is an understatement. It got very personal very quickly, and you became the target very quickly. Just give me a flavour, Ginny, of what you remember about that first wave of criticism that you received. How did it sort of manifest itself?
I mean, front page stories in the big papers in Boston, talk radio was particularly vicious right away. Editorials, which are supposed to be, if not objective, at least somewhat based in facts, calling on me to step down. Editorials saying that surely it had to have been Logan Airport and Ginny Buckingham, because why else would two planes have been hijacked from Boston? Headlines saying I should atone for what had happened by stepping down. Columns saying I should be a stay-at-home mom. What right did I have to still have a job? Just very, very brutal. And at first I was able to not take it in, and I resolutely made sure my staff was not paying attention to it, because they had a very important job to do. So we would have daily staff meetings to kind of make sure we were on track for all the operational logistics that we had to perform. And also we became the first airport to press for federalization of security. And so using our place as the center of what had happened, calling on Congress and the FAA and others to change things became our focus, even while there's a poll being commissioned by a newspaper in Boston where more than half of the public said that I should be fired. And so it was that kind of dichotomy of staying focused on the work while the swirl happened. What I didn't know at the time is the swirl started to take root in my heart and soul, and started to sow a seed of doubt in my own conscience of, are they right? I respect people, especially these editorial writers who are so smart and I work with all the time, and they're saying it's me. So what could I have done better? And 20 years later, that might sound foolish, but it really did start to seep in to the point where I wrestled with it for years.
What people didn't know at that stage, of course, Ginny, was that you were 5 weeks pregnant. You had a young son at home. For your family, your husband David. I mean, the impact of those days, of those accusations, as you say, at the beginning of a very, very long and painful journey for you, but it must have been terrible for them as well.
I mean, my son was little and, mostly just wanted his mom home. He didn't understand why I was never there.
Yeah.
My daughter, who I was carrying and worried I would lose, and then at one point horrifically thought I deserved to lose because of the stress of the pregnancy. They both became my purpose afterwards, after I resigned from Logan, and I was determined for only one reason, to try to survive this, and that was to be a good mom to them. And so I'm grateful that I had them. You
said there that at one stage you thought, in your own head, you were saying maybe you deserved to lose your child.
The guilt that I started to feel, maybe not consciously feel, but somewhere deep down felt, was clearly starting to affect how I was thinking about my future, my children's future.
I mean, that's a incredibly Powerful statement. Do you remember that period of time? How you then were able to pull yourself out of that, if you like? Tell me what was going through your mind as you were having, the darkest of thoughts there. How did you lead yourself out?
It was the work. I mean, so long as I was working to make things better, while I still was at Logan, I think that's what allowed me to just put one foot in front of the other and keep pushing. The purpose of trying to improve safety and be, a leading example of how the systems we had in place needed to change. Once I left Logan, it was just pure survival for a long time. And if I didn't have, a toddler to take care of, if I didn't give birth to my daughter and have to take care of a little baby, I don't know what would happen. But that was my focus, was being a good mom to them.
We'll be right back after this. As regular listeners know, Crisis What Crisis is brought to you with a little help from Mindstream, a personal well-being music company designed to create those calmer moments in our hectic lives. Mindstream can really help put you back on track and guide you towards the mindfulness that we all need to function more effectively. And I can tell you from personal experience that it really works. Mindstream music is cleverly designed to help regulate your body's response to stressful situations by slowing your heartbeat and guiding you towards that more calmer state. They also have playlists to stimulate your brain, helping to keep you focused and engaged for longer periods of time. Getting your mindset right is the absolute key when you're navigating a crisis, or if you're just struggling with day-to-day pressures. You'll find them at mindstream.com. That's mind with a Y. They're also on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, wherever you download your music from. So take back some control and consider making a Mindstream playlist one of your crisis cures. I don't think you'll regret it. And now back to Ginny. You resigned from your job under pressure. As I understand it, you weren't given much choice in the matter by your boss, by the governor. Can you tell me a bit about that process and those and that decision in the end?
Being a political professional, I of course saw the signs along the way of where this was leading. In a private meeting with the governor, where she told me she didn't blame me, but didn't know how this was all going to turn out. Being told by her chief of staff that I could no longer contact her directly. She held press conferences, formed a blue ribbon commission to reform Logan Airport, all the things that politicians do in a normal situation, unexpected in my view in this kind of situation. And then I was told that they were calling around from the State House trying to figure out a replacement for me. So it was pretty obvious what was going to happen. And, I wanted to, I think, be the master of my own fate when it came to that. So I opted to resign.
Do you sometimes think that you wish you'd fought it harder, longer, had more of or do you think it was just an impossible situation?
I think it was impossible. With hindsight, I wish I had just stood up and said the truth and said, this is not real. This had nothing to do with Logan Airport. This has nothing to do with me being a political appointee. Please focus on the very pressing security needs that our country now is aware of in a way that we were never aware of before. I didn't have that clarity. I didn't have that courage at the time.
I am a resigning recidivist, I should tell you. I've resigned from a number of jobs, Ginny. When you resign, there is also the risk, of course, that people will say, right, well, there you are.
Yes.
Because no one resigns. No one resigns without good reason.
I asked that question, actually, the night before I held a press conference to resign. Said, how do I do this without people thinking forever that it's my fault that thousands of people are dead? And there was no answer to that.
Have you found an answer to it subsequently, or do you say to yourself, actually, maybe I shouldn't have done. Maybe I should have let them push.
No, I still think for my own sake, for my family's sake, even for my Logan colleagues' sake, to just be able to move forward and focus on what they had to get done. It was the right thing to do.
Yeah. After you leave the job, a while later, you go to work on a Boston newspaper as a senior editor. A surprising choice, some might say, given the torrid time that you'd had with the media. Tell us about it.
Well, such fun, right? First of all, you know that.
Yeah.
There's maybe no more fun job in the world than working at a newspaper. And I work for a tabloid, the number 2 paper in Boston. So they were kind of the scrappy underdog, which appealed to me. First of all, I'm as I mentioned, I love writing. I've always wanted a career as a writer. So as I was kind of looking around at what the heck do I do now, having been disgraced and removed from the political path of governing that I was on, and then I think maybe in my psyche somewhere, I thought, if I go there, then everything they said wasn't real. So I can go work there and be this other person that I always have been. And for whatever reason, I got the job and stayed there for 4 years and had the time of my life.
Yeah.
Read 5 newspapers a day, was paid to do that, was paid to tell my opinion in the paper, interviewed the same politicians I had wrangled with previously. It was a joy.
So you're properly kind of, albeit from a entirely different perspective, but you are kind of, you're back in the game of judgment, of journalism, obviously, but that mixture of agendas and everything else that comes with the collision of politics and news, you still got this huge kind of weight to carry. How are you managing that, I suppose, is my question. Were you thinking that one would solve the other, if you like? I mean,
the way I describe it in my book is every time I felt like I was swimming to the surface of the water, something would happen that would push me back under. So I had this new career that was really a dream in many, many ways. And I would get phone calls at my desk, because obviously I was a public person, so to speak, again, demanding that I apologize for 9/11. One woman would call me once a week and leave me a voicemail saying, I don't know how you live with yourself, given what you've done. It was this place of trying to move on and then not being able to, until I was sitting at my desk at the newspaper when my lawyer called me and told me that I had been sued personally for wrongful death. This was in 2003. And that was the ultimate pushing me down back under, because to have an actual family, not just anonymous, radio talk show hosts and callers, an actual family, a mom of 2 little boys, hold me accountable for her husband's murder, crushed me. It crushed me. And I don't do anything to hold her in my heart. Her pain has to be so much exponentially harder to bear than mine, but it shattered me that a family would think I could have stopped it.
How did that manifest itself with you? Were you able to do a version of what you'd done on the day itself and focus purely on work again, or not this time?
I mean, yes, because I could do nothing but work. And work and take care of my kids. I did contemplate whether I could bear it. And that's a painful thing to write about and talk about. I do write about it in my book. I went the day or two afterwards, drove to a little private beach in my hometown and sat there and wondered if I could bear to live with being blamed by this family.
This is days before the second anniversary, I think. Is that right?
That's correct. So in September. And Bruce Springsteen at the time had put out the Rising album, which is all about, overcoming and moving forward as a community together post 9/11. And I would listen to that soundtrack over and over and over. And I was listening to one of the songs, which is called Empty Sky, about just what it sounds like, the no planes in the sky, but also for me, a shattering of faith, a shattering of who I was on the one hand. And on the other hand, I'm thinking Jack and Maddie, who are my two little ones at the time, they don't deserve to lose their mother. They didn't do anything wrong. And it took every ounce of strength I had to pull out of that beach parking lot and go home and promise them. I knelt by my son's bed and I promised him, he was sound asleep, that I would never leave him. And I held on to that promise as strongly as I've ever held on to anything in my life.
When you were in the car, what was the other voice telling you to do?
Drive forward, drive into the water, drive until the water covers me and the pain goes away.
So through this period, I imagine from the very start of this process, you will, of course, you've got a very big family, a big loving family. You've got a lot of friends, I'm sure, around you. Your husband, most importantly, David. A lot of people telling you, I assume, you can't let this push you down in the way that it was with regularity. That you did nothing wrong. You've got to, let it go and move on. You write brilliantly in your book about why that doesn't work. It's
very isolating. Everyone who said those words to me meant it with the most love and support and help. But what they didn't know, that every time they expressed the move on or this, was just politics. Like, no one really blamed you. It was just politics. Wasn't true to what my experience was. And I was truly blamed. And it wasn't just politics. It was a reason people felt they had to put this burden on me so they felt safer. And I couldn't justify or understand how I can move on when that was actually my reality. So I felt very alone in the journey, even with my loving friends and family around me, because they didn't understand either. Everyone wanted me to just be better and be the Ginny Buckingham they always knew, successful and strong. And I just wasn't that person anymore.
So these people are saying these kind words to you. You're saying thank you and nodding and probably smiling. But inside your head, you're screaming, you just don't get it.
Yeah, the only one I screamed at was my dear husband.
So you actually screamed at him.
Well, with him, I was just like, it isn't just politics. I was blamed, and we had this argument over and over and over again. And, ultimately he got it. It took a while, but ultimately he understood. And honestly, it wasn't until the book came out that I think most people understood then. The passage of time, I think, allowed that to happen. Broader context, all of those things. But I was alone in it for quite a while. That's the
truth. That's the truth of trauma, isn't it? That it is by its nature terribly lonely.
Yes. And empathy and compassion goes a long way. And if you know someone who's suffering trauma or in the middle of a crisis, just listen. Just be there. Don't try to explain it away. That doesn't help.
Yes. Ginny, you struck up a close and very significant relationship with Anne McFarlane, the mother of a 9/11 victim, Marianne, who worked for United Airlines. When did you first meet? Tell us about that. Tell us about your relationship.
Everyone should have an Anne McFarlane in their life. I wish everyone did. She is a fiery Boston Irish lady whose daughter was her best friend. Anne, also worked at the airport. She actually worked for Massport, but I didn't know her then. She was in customer service. And when I learned that her daughter had died on one of the planes, I knew I needed and wanted to go to her memorial service, which was just a week or so after 9/11, but right in the midst of this media firestorm. And as I was waiting in a line that went around the block from the church, I could hear the whispers of people, kind of see the finger pointing. And I didn't know how Anne would react to having me there. I didn't know she blamed me. I didn't know she'd be angry. So I was fearful. And, I entered the back of the church, and she was at the end of a long line. And I'll never forget this moment. She's not very tall. She's probably 5'3" or something like that. And she had a pin of an airplane on her lapel. And she took both of my hands in hers, and she said, "Do not let them tear our airport apart. Promise me." Her love of aviation, her daughter's love of aviation, was something that they both embraced, and it was so meaningful to them, and that she could see outside of her own pain and have that perspective just blew me away.
And you became friends.
So, I know now why I did it. At the time, I don't think I was clear, but I reached out to her the following June, so June of 2002, and said, "I don't know if you remember me, but wondered if you would meet for coffee," because I wanted to ask a family member directly if they blamed me. And I also wanted to mourn for someone directly. I didn't know anyone personally that died on 9/11, gratefully so. But I felt such pain and such trauma that I wanted to just be part of someone else's grief. And so we met for coffee at this little coffee shop, and she brought me a mass card so I could see her daughter's picture. And she had a pendant around her neck with her daughter's picture in it. She gave me a teddy bear that NASA had given her. They sent a bunch of flags up to space, to the space station, in honor of all the victims. So she gave me some of those memorabilia. And finally, after talking for a while, I just asked her straight out, "Do you blame me for what happened to your daughter?" And she was so taken aback. She said, "You're no more to blame than Marianne is." And then, because she's a strong person, she's like, "So what are you going to do now? What's the rest of your life look like?" And I said, I'll try to write my story. I'll try to, move forward. And she said, "Do it. Live your life in Marianne's name." It was the biggest gift I've ever received.
I was going to ask you, how important a moment was that in the moment, and how important has it become to you?
It's remained my life raft, and incredibly, I think I've become somewhat of a life raft for her as well. A couple years later, they finally found some remains of Marianne, and it happened to be a day that I gave testimony before the 9/11 Commission investigators, which was very difficult and brutal. And I went back to my office at the newspaper, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Anne McFarlane saying they found Marianne. And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "They found some remains. I don't know how much, but all this time I thought maybe she had amnesia and was just going to walk in the door one day. I'm going to need to lean on you now." And I think that friendship has sustained her in some way as well. And I'm really grateful for that.
Ginny, the court cases eventually end or are ended with no blame attached. And the official 9/11 Commission concludes that you did nothing wrong, that Logan was chosen by the terrorists for its location. And not because of any particular weaknesses or political connections or whatever, as you touched on earlier. Tell us about that day when you finally learn that the official decision has been made and you are exonerated.
I was in such a strange position because I was working at the newspaper and covering the release of the 9/11 Commission report from an editorial perspective. And so it had this, dichotomy of, this is it. Like, what if they say it's Logan, then it's Logan, and there's no change in that. And if they don't, then that will also obviously be enormously powerful. But they didn't say anything about it in the press conference. So I watched the whole press conference, nothing said about Logan at all. I went immediately to the bookstore, and remember, I don't know if you remember, but at the time they sent this report in book form to stores all over the country and world, and they couldn't be opened until after the press conference. So I went and bought the first one that I could, flipped through the whole thing, couldn't see anything about Logan Airport. My name's not even in it. That's also something that I've tried to absorb, that despite being at the center of this storm, I'm not even mentioned in there, i.e. I had nothing to do with it in reality. But when I did testify before the 9/11 investigators, I asked them, even though my lawyer told me not to, I asked them point blank, if you find that Logan Airport is not to blame for this, will you please say so? Not just for me, but for all the thousands of people who work at Logan Airport. And as I turned to the back where the footnotes were, thousands of footnotes, the very first one said that Logan Airport had no different security at the level that mattered, which was the checkpoint gates, and that the planes were likely chosen for logistical reasons. So there it was in black and white. I wish I felt relief. I wish that at that moment I felt some big weight lifted. And this maybe it's embarrassing to admit, but I only felt anger. I was so angry and so full of despair. Why then did I have to go through this? Why did I have to lose my whole career? Why did I have to be blamed if it wasn't even remotely true? And I had to let that go too. You can't dwell in anger and despair either, but I did. Poor David again got the brunt of a lot of yelling.
So anger is the predominant emotion in your mind at that point. No relief.
Not at that point. Certainly, it's been incredibly important to me in the years following that the official word said it wasn't Logan. Although I have to say, it's taken me a long time to understand this, but my therapist at the time, who was incredibly helpful during this whole journey, said, they could come out the other way and they could say it was Logan, and that doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it true. And you're going to have to, no matter what they say, hold on to what you know is true and not rely on some official word. And she was right. I'm grateful I didn't have to grapple with that being the reality.
How did you feel about some of the individuals involved, can I ask? Because some bitterness would have been justified. Jane Swift, who I think was the governor at the time when you left the job, that conversation that you described earlier about the or the political positioning that you described earlier, I should say. How did you feel about her once you were cleared?
I mean, I try not to dwell in bitterness at all, because again, it doesn't serve me. I'm not saying I'm a superhero who doesn't feel bitter. Of course I do. But I just try not to stay there when I feel that way. I try to look at it that she was a young, inexperienced leader who was faced with an unfathomable tragedy, and she was not able to rise to the occasion of leadership that was required, and leave it at that, and try to take whatever lessons I can about being a leader forward.
Have you ever seen her again? Have you met? Have you been in the same room?
No.
What's your technique for avoiding the bitterness pit when you can see it coming, or if you find yourself sort of standing in it occasionally? What technique do you use to kind of get yourself out and on?
I'm new to it, but I've been trying to practice gratitude. And they say that if you think of 3 things you're grateful for, it actually impacts your brain, that the way your brain operates is changed. So I try to go to gratitude as quickly as I can.
Yeah. How have you come, though, to reconcile the blame more generally, Ginny? How have you got that, if you like, into the right place? I mean, you mentioned counselling there. Has that been a fundamental part of your recovery?
Yes. So my therapist is actually a sexual crisis counselor, so something totally different. But as she knows and has taught me, all trauma is the same. Whatever its source, its impact is the same. And the most important thing she helped me finally realize is that you have to hold on to what you know is true. And deep down inside, I now know that I did not do anything wrong that day or before that day. And there was nothing I could have done to change what had happened that day, as much as I wish there was. I think I always had that truth, but I couldn't find it because the noise and the voices of blame were so loud. And I hope that with telling my story, that the culture of blame and the destructiveness of blame is kind of shown in the spotlight, and perhaps will change somebody's point of view when either as a citizen or as a leader. I hope that people, in particular women, hold on to their truth when they know what they know inside. Hold on to it, no matter what the voices around you are saying. Be your own hero. I looked and looked and looked for someone to be my hero. I wanted, whether it was the 9/11 Commission or President Bush or the front page of the Boston Globe, to say, whoops, sorry, we were wrong, not your fault. That never happened. And I've come to see that even if it did happen, unless I held onto it myself and believed it myself, that was the most important thing. So holding on to that, being your own hero, is something I try to put out in the world and hope it helps other people.
Which I think is a wonderful endeavor. We touched on it at the start of the conversation, though. The world is not moving in that direction, is it? How do we begin to solve this? Because in the end, it is a dilemma for leaders first and foremost. Would you agree?
I completely agree, because it's up to them to lead the way and listen with empathy and an open heart and an open mind. And the politics in the U.S., and I know it's very different there. It's like as bad as it could get. There is no one truth that everyone can even accept as something to start from in terms of where we have our conversations. So what's the answer? Beats me, but keep doing our part. That's all we can do. We're individual people. I do some TV, I do some talking, some other writing. I'm just trying to do my part and hope it matters somehow.
Would you ever work in politics again?
No.
That's a fast answer, Ginny.
Well, first and foremost, it's a young person's game, in my opinion. I work 24 hours a day, 7 days.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
Yeah, and I don't want to do that anymore. That's for sure. I want to be engaged. I want my kids to be engaged. I want to write about it. I want to think about it, talk about it, but work at it? No, thank you.
Is there not part of you, though, that thinks if I was now back in one of my old jobs, either as a chief of staff, or let's say as a chief of staff, I would be in that room, right? When the leader has a choice between, sticking the blame on someone or not, or using, blame to be able to, as you put it, control the uncontrollable. You'd be there. There's an argument, isn't there, that you'd have more influence potentially.
That's true. Sorry. So if I could work in the White House as chief of staff, sure. I'd go there. I think about who's my dream audience if I could get invited to speak anywhere. And it would be to a room of leaders, whether governors, if all 50 governors of the United States or CEOs of the top 50 companies in the world. Like I would love to have that kind of bigger impact with my story. So, I can keep dreaming of that.
Okay. Never say never then.
Right.
We've moved from no to maybe there, Ginny.
Well, I forgot about that staff from the White House.
I just want to finish by talking a little about resilience, because I was very taken by your effective definition of resilience in the book, where you say that happy endings are a comforting nonsense, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a good life, but you carry those difficult moments with you. And that, in fact, is the definition of resilience: moving forward with those problems, not moving on. I thought that was fantastic. Is that how you feel now about your history, about your experiences, that they're with you, but you've just now learned how to keep moving forward with them?
It's a more realistic and true way of living, isn't it? I mean, we can't just leave our pain in the past, especially traumatic pain. We do carry it with us. I use the metaphor of sea glass in my book because I felt for so long that I was failing at being resilient. I'm like, everyone's saying be strong and move forward and get over it, and I felt so not strong in that until I thought about sea glass and how it starts off as something completely different, a full bottle or whatever, and is thrown into the sea and tossed around in the tumult of the waves and the sand and the salt for years and years and years, until it doesn't resemble anything like it started. Yet it's still incredibly beautiful, incredibly valuable, incredibly capable of bringing joy to those who find it resting in the sand. And to me, that's resilience. You're something different. You're changed forever, yet you still are capable of beauty and joy.
That's wonderful. Ginny, thank you for telling us your story. Before we let you go, though, we'd like to ask you for your 3 crisis cures. These are 3 very specific things that you've lent on, used, deployed to help get you through the difficult days. Only rule is it can't be another person. I'm sure if it were, you would have chosen David. But
you'd like that.
let me ask you for your first crisis cure, please.
Make your home or a room in your home a haven for you during crisis and as you're healing. I have one little sitting room in the corner of my house that has my candles and my artwork and my books, and that's where I curl up in the corner and just take a breath and say, okay, go at this again tomorrow. Wonderful.
Your second cure?
Find a purpose outside of yourself in your current situation to devote yourself to. In my case, I was very lucky that I had 2 little kids to devote myself to and take care of outside of what was happening in the rest of my life. But whether it's parenting or taking care of your dog or your neighbor or doing something that's outside of what's happening to give some purpose and meaning to your day to day.
Wonderful. And your last crisis cue?
Do good with something bad. Do good with something bad. In my case, I took my story and I put it in a book and I put it out in the world, and gratefully it's helping people. So don't just let the bad things sit. Take advantage of the crisis and do good with it.
Wonderful. Ginny, we're so glad that you did exactly that. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation, which I think has been an incredibly useful one for anyone who's trying to navigate their way through trauma. And we wish you the very best for the future.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation very much.
There's nothing here that you don't already know. It's all inside you.